In 2019, we saw one of the most remarkable election wins in Australian history, I think, with Scott Morrison leading the coalition to a third consecutive term. But much has changed in just 20 years in this country when Prime Minister John Howard and the Treasurer at the time, Peter Costello, took a GST to the election and miraculously won. Well, the Cabinet papers from that time have been released today, and it's a fascinating look at what went on in the war room of Cabinet. Joining me to discuss 1998, 1999 in Cabinet is the Herald Sun's national politics editor, James Campbell, who's in Melbourne. Happy New Year to you, James.
Happy New Year to you, Chris.
Well, we learnt today about the angst over the GST. Cabinet met 9 times in a month to talk about it. I could just imagine how nervous they would have been when you consider that any kind of discussion about tax reform nowadays is very, very quietly whispered.
Absolutely. It's interesting, the papers themselves are very, very light on for details about what they said at these Cabinet meetings. I think one of them just said that a proposal for a new tax was discussed and approved. And as Costello said today or yesterday, at the time of when they were doing the lockup, that meeting went for 7 hours. But it doesn't really record, obviously, the to and fro on this. There would have been some very, very, very nervous politicians. I mean, the reality, of course, was that the only reason they did this, or they were sort of forced into it, was because the High Court had in 1997 thrown out the state's abilities to levy a whole lot of taxes on, cigarettes, alcohol, all that sort of stuff, and they had to find a way of replacing that revenue. It was a sort of make-do situation.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And interesting still to see that you can't rely on polls. We thought that was only the case last year, but we learned today that back in 1998, an exit poll on election day was given to the PM, was given to the Treasurer, and they were bracing for defeat because of this GST, weren't they?
Absolutely, and it does do well to remember, though, that the government actually lost the two-party preferred vote at that election. Beazley got more votes than Howard. It was just that he got them in the wrong places. He racked up big majorities in places where he didn't need them, and the government was just able to hang on very, very, very narrowly. They lost, and I can't remember what the number was, but they lost an extraordinary number of seats at that election. They literally fell over the line after only 2 and a bit years in office. It was a really sobering experience for them. They hadn't had much of a first term, really. There'd been a lot of resignations from a lot of ministers who'd done silly stuff. There was a sense, I think, in that first term of the Howard government that they didn't really have much of an agenda after they had dealt with the cuts that they needed to bring in to bring the budget back into surplus.
Yeah. And
bringing the GST in sort of gave them something to kind of put before the public that they were intending to do. It was a brave decision.
Sure was. 1999 and East Timor votes for full independence, but there were real fears, we learned today, that Indonesian militants weren't going to have any part of it, and it could have exploded in our faces, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Nobody really was sure which way the Indonesian government would jump. Were they going to permit us to send a peacekeeping force in? It was really largely, we forget now, a lot of pressure from the Clinton administration and their envoy to the area, Richard Holbrooke, who put a lot of pressure on the Indonesians. They, of course, found the whole experience incredibly humiliating. We were trying to balance the catastrophe that was unfolding before us with trying to manage the long-term relationship with one of the biggest, most populous Muslim countries in the world that's on our doorstep. When you look back now, 20 years later, it's a miracle almost how well this came off. This really could have been a disaster. When you look at the options that were on the table, we could have ended up in a shooting war with these militias, or even with the Indonesian armed forces, or a permanent sort of cold war with them over this, over East Timor. you know, we should really thank our lucky stars the way it turned out.
Especially in light of what we're reading today. Now, this was the era of the introduction or the birth of the internet, and ASIO was given authority to remotely hack into computers, James.
Yeah, well, are we surprised by that?
Well, given what the Signals Directorate would prefer to do, no, really?
No, I mean, I suppose that as soon as some new form of communication is invented, the spooks will find a way of trying to read our mail, I suppose. That's what we pay them for.
They're still doing it, and to some degree very successfully, to prevent terrorism at the moment. How do you reckon John Howard and Peter Costello would deal with the shape of the current economy, given the fact that they were intent on producing surpluses right from their very first term, and they're saying today in those interviews they've done for Sky News, they're saying, well, hang on a second, the Prime Minister needs to make sure that he's focused on a surplus and don't throw in short-term stimulus packages, because that's not what he should be doing. So how would they go about igniting or stimulating what is a stagnating economy at the moment?
Well, that was the bit that they didn't really make clear, I suppose. They, in their interviews, they've admitted that the Reserve Bank's sort of run out of ammo. There's very little now that they can do in terms of interest rates having an impact on the economy. They're as close to zero as they could be. Any further cuts won't have much difference. They
Waste of time.
much different. And in fact, John Howard's open about the fact that he thinks that they've cut them too far, that the interest rates should be higher. It's a very good question. I mean, you'd have to go back to, I suppose, microeconomic reform and or productivity, and knowing those two gentlemen, they'd probably go back to labour market reform, which of course has been a real no-no in Australian political circles since the debacle of work choices, which in 2007 led to the defeat of the Howard government.
Or would they take the infrastructure route and say, we're going to build fast trains, we're going to employ another 60,000 people in New South Wales and 40,000 people in Melbourne and run fast trains from city to city?
Yeah, but that costs money, doesn't it? I mean, they're saying they should hold to their budget surplus line. You can obviously push the put the pedal down on spending, but you can't necessarily have a surplus at the same time without increasing taxes, which of course have a strangling effect on the economy. There's no real simple answers here unless they're prepared to look at some ways in which they can boost the productivity of the economy. And when you look around it, you come back to labour market reform, and there's no sign that this government or any government, certainly no Labor government, is interested in doing anything about that.
Yep. Good to have you on the program tonight, James, National Political Editor for the Herald Sun. Have a great new year. Have a great 2020.
Thanks, Chris.
Good on you.